In 2007, in the heart of Paris, right outside the Élysée Palace, a tent went up. Not a camping tent, a colossal structure so heavy it had to be flown in on its own dedicated aircraft, lined inside with silk carpets, perfumed with incense, and guarded by an all-female security detail dressed in combat fatigues and high heels, women who had sworn an oath of chastity to serve one man alone. That man had just been received by the President of France with the full honors of a visiting head of state. Only a few years earlier, the same man had sat near the top of the West's list of the most dangerous state sponsors of terrorism on the planet. He was born in a different kind of tent, a real Bedouin tent, pitched in the Libyan desert into a family of illiterate herders. No one, least of all the boy himself, could have imagined that he would one day stand as an equal among the most powerful leaders on earth, and then, a few years later, die in a drainage pipe, barely a few dozen kilometers from where he was born. That man was Muammar Gaddafi. For 42 years, he was one of the hardest men of the century to categorize. He toppled a king in a bloodless coup at 27, then used his country's oil wealth to build one of the most generous free healthcare and education systems in Africa. At the same time, he was the man behind one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in aviation history, one that left a small Scottish town forever remembered for the worst possible reason. Ronald Reagan once called him the mad dog of the Middle East. Less than 2 decades later, British Prime Minister Tony Blair shook his hand inside his own compound, calling it a new era of cooperation. The question here isn't whether Gaddafi was good or evil. The real answer is messier than any label. The real question is, how does one man become the West's most wanted enemy and then its embraced partner within a single lifetime? And what finally caused 4 decades of power to collapse in only a few months? This is the full story of Muammar Gaddafi. From the shepherd boy expelled from school at 19, to the self-declared brother leader of a nation, to his final hours running through the streets of his own hometown. If you enjoy history told with this kind of depth, hit like, subscribe so you don't miss what's next, and drop a comment telling me which controversial figure you want covered next. I read every one. To understand how a boy born with nothing could one day dine with kings and later stare down an American president, you have to start not with Muammar Gaddafi the revolutionary, but with the empty, wind-scoured land that raised him, a landscape that had already been fighting off empires for decades before he was even born. Libya, in the years before Gaddafi's birth, was not a nation in any modern sense. For most of its recorded history, the territory that would eventually bear that name had been governed as 3 loosely connected provinces of the Ottoman Empire: Tripolitania in the northwest, Cyrenaica in the east, and Fezzan, the vast desert interior in the south, where Gaddafi's own family would eventually settle. These were not regions bound together by a shared national identity. They were bound, if at all, by tribal networks, trade routes, and the shared experience of being ruled by whoever happened to be strong enough to claim them. In 1911, that ruler changed. Italy, eager to join the other European powers in the scramble for African colonies, invaded the Ottoman territories that would become Libya, and the occupation that followed was brutal, even by the standards of European colonialism at the time. Italian forces, and later the fascist administration under Mussolini, waged a campaign against Libyan resistance, most famously embodied by the Senussi guerrilla leader Omar Mukhtar, who fought a stubborn insurgency from the mountains of Cyrenaica for nearly 2 decades before being captured and publicly hanged by Italian authorities in 1931, in front of thousands of Libyans forced to watch as a warning. Across the country, Entire tribal populations were displaced into concentration camps along the coast, where disease and starvation killed tens of thousands. Resistance fighters were captured and executed publicly, their bodies left on display in town squares as a warning to anyone who might consider following their example. According to family accounts passed down through generations, Muammar's own grandfather, Abdesalam Bouminyar, was among those killed by Italian forces during this invasion. Cut down not in some abstract chapter of a history textbook, but in the living memory of the very family that would go on to raise the man who eventually ruled Libya for over 4 decades. This detail matters more than it might first appear. Long before Gaddafi ever read a page of Arab nationalist theory, before he had even heard the name Gamal Abdel Nasser, the central lesson of his childhood had already been passed to him around a fire, in whispered family stories, in the kind of oral history that Bedouin families carried instead of written records. Foreign powers do not arrive to help, they arrive to take. And if you resist, they will kill you for it. By the time Italy's colonial project in Libya finally ended, its authority shattered by defeat in the Second World War, its remaining forces expelled by British and French administration in the years that followed, the territory that emerged in 1951 as the independent Kingdom of Libya was, by almost any measure, one of the poorest countries on earth. There was no meaningful industry to speak of. Literacy rates hovered in the single digits across much of the interior. The economy survived largely on foreign aid, the rents paid by Britain and the United States for their military bases, and whatever livestock and produce the country's tribal populations could coax out of a landscape that was overwhelmingly desert. Libya's oil wealth, the resource that would eventually transform the country and fund Gaddafi's entire revolutionary project, would not be discovered in significant commercial quantities until 1959, years after the child born in a tent near Sirte had already absorbed the central lessons of his early life. Into this newly independent but desperately poor kingdom, on June 7, 1942, Muammar Gaddafi was born in a goatskin tent, pitched in the desert near Qasr Abu Hadi, a rural stretch of land outside the coastal town of Sirte. His family belonged to the Kadhadfa, a small clan of Arabized Berber descent that carried little weight in the tribal hierarchies that dominated Libyan politics at the time, not one of the powerful families connected to the royal court in Tripoli, not linked to wealth, land, or influence of any kind. In a country where political power still flowed largely through tribal affiliation rather than formal institutions, being born into an unremarkable tribe was itself a kind of inherited disadvantage, a ceiling placed over a person's prospects before they had spoken their first word. His father, Abu Meniar, was an itinerant herder, moving livestock, goats, sheep, sometimes camels, across the unforgiving terrain of the Sirte Basin, the way his own ancestors had for generations, following seasonal grazing patterns dictated by scarce rainfall and even scarcer wells. It was a life organized entirely around subsistence, vulnerable to drought, disease, and the whims of a desert climate that offered no margin for error. Neither Abu Meniar nor his wife, Aisha, could read a single word. Gaddafi would later describe his childhood home not merely as poor, but as existing largely outside the modern world altogether. No electricity, no running water, no fixed address beyond the shifting coordinates of wherever the family's tent happened to be pitched that season. And yet, this is the detail so many biographers return to. Illiteracy in the parents did not mean indifference to education for their son. When Muammar was 7 years old, his father made a decision that, for a family with essentially no material resources to spare, represented a significant sacrifice. He arranged for the boy to be tutored at home by a local Quranic teacher, determined that his youngest child would have something he himself never had: the ability to read the world around him, to understand the Quran directly rather than only through the recitation of others. 2 years later, at 9, the boy was sent to the elementary school in Sirte itself, a decision that meant long absences from the family's nomadic routine and, quite literally, a foot placed in a settled, literate world his parents had never known. What happened next tells you almost everything about the kind of mind Gaddafi possessed even as a child. Libyan elementary education at the time was structured around 6 years of coursework. Gaddafi completed all 6 grades in just 4, not through shortcuts or special arrangement, but by simply outpacing the material he was given, absorbing lessons meant to be spread across years in a fraction of that time. Teachers who later spoke about him described a boy who read obsessively whenever books were available, who followed international news on the radio with an intensity unusual for someone his age, and who carried himself with a formality and seriousness that seemed to belong to someone much older than he was. Classmates recalled a boy who spoke rarely in casual conversation, but who, when a subject genuinely interested him, could hold forth with an intensity that made adults in the room stop and listen. But brilliance did not buy him acceptance. At school in Sirte, Gaddafi was marked immediately and permanently as an outsider, not because of anything he did, but because of where he came from. He was Bedouin, from a poor and undistinguished tribal background, arriving at a school system that quietly but unmistakably favored the sons of settled, propertied families from the town itself. Classmates and even teachers treated his origins as something to be tolerated rather than respected. He was mocked for his accent, thick with the inflections of the desert interior, rather than the coastal dialect considered more refined. He was mocked for the coarseness of his clothing, sewn from whatever rough cloth his family could afford, standing out sharply against the more polished dress of boys from merchant or land-owning households. He was mocked, most simply and most painfully, for the plain fact that his family slept in a tent in the desert, while theirs slept in houses with walls and roofs. This is the seed so many later accounts trace his politics back to, not abstract ideology first, but a very personal, very specific wound, the humiliation of being treated as less than, for reasons that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with the accident of birth. Whatever else Gaddafi would become, and he would become many things over the following decades, some of them monstrous, the boy who sat in that classroom in Sirte, aware that his intelligence would never fully erase his origins in the eyes of his peers, never entirely disappeared. Decades later, as the absolute ruler of an oil-rich state, with access to virtually unlimited luxury, he would still insist on receiving foreign dignitaries inside a Bedouin tent, still describe himself first and always as a son of the desert, still frame his entire political project as a defense of the poor, the tribal, the overlooked, against the comfortable and the privileged. This was not simply theatre, though it certainly became theatre over time. At its root, it was the one identity that had belonged to him before anyone had the chance to look down on him for it. And reclaiming that identity, elevating it rather than hiding it, would remain a constant thread through every phase of his life. When Gaddafi's family relocated to Saba, the principal town of the Fezzan region, deep in Libya's southwest, a dusty garrison town that served as the administrative center for the country's vast desert interior, to enroll him in secondary school, the isolated grievances of a poor tribal boy began to fuse with something much larger. The currents of history reshaping the entire Arab world, arriving in Sabha not through newspapers, which few in the town could afford or read, but through the one technology that had genuinely penetrated even the most remote corners of Libya, the transistor radio. The timing could hardly have been more consequential. Gaddafi's teenage years in Sabah coincided almost exactly with a series of earthquakes moving across the Middle East, each one broadcast into Libya through crackling shortwave signal. In 1948, the Arab-Israeli War ended in what Arab nationalists across the region experienced as a collective humiliation, a defeat many blamed not just on Israel and the Western powers that supported its founding, but on the corruption and military incompetence of the old Arab monarchies, regimes many young Arabs increasingly viewed as more loyal to their former colonial patrons than to the Arab cause itself. Then, in 1952, came the event that would define Gaddafi's entire political imagination for the rest of his life. A group of young military officers in Egypt, led by a charismatic colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew the corrupt, British-backed monarchy of King Farouk. Nasser was everything the old order was not. Young, forceful, unapologetically anti-colonial, and utterly convinced that the Arab world's future depended on throwing off foreign domination once and for all. Not through gradual reform, but through decisive revolutionary action. When Nasser stood up to Britain, France, and Israel during the Suez Crisis of 1956, nationalizing the Suez Canal Company and, despite suffering a military defeat on the battlefield, emerging as the undisputed political victor once international pressure forced the invading powers to withdraw in humiliation, he became something close to a living legend across the entire Arab world, from Morocco to Iraq. And nowhere did that legend land harder or lodge itself more permanently than in the mind of a teenage boy in a dusty schoolhouse in Sabha, listening to Nasser's speeches on Voice of the Arabs radio and hearing, for the first time in his life, a version of the future that did not require submission to anyone, European, monarchist or otherwise. By 1958, Nasser's ambitions had produced the United Arab Republic, a political union between Egypt and Syria built on the promise that Arab nations, unified under revolutionary leadership, could finally stand as equals to the powers that had colonized and humiliated them for over a century. For a generation of young Arabs coming of age at exactly this moment, the UAR was not an abstract diplomatic arrangement. It was proof of concept. It said, in the clearest possible terms, this is achievable. Empires can be reversed. Humiliation is not permanent. So when Syria abruptly seceded from the Union in 1961, collapsing Nasser's grand experiment in Arab unity after barely 3 years, the news did not stay confined to newspapers and diplomatic cables, read only by government officials. It reached Sabha. It reached a 19-year-old Gaddafi, who by this point had spent years absorbing Nasser's rhetoric with something close to religious devotion. And Gaddafi did something that, in hindsight, was the first unmistakable sign of everything that would follow. He organized a demonstration, leading fellow students in a public protest against Syria's withdrawal from the Union, and personally raising funds among his classmates to send telegrams of solidarity directly to Nasser in Cairo, an extraordinary act of political initiative for a teenager with no institutional power, no family connections, and absolutely no protection if things went wrong. Things went wrong. School administrators, alarmed by a student organizing unauthorized political demonstrations in a monarchy that took a famously dim view of dissent of any kind, expelled him from school. At 19 years old, Muammar Gaddafi's formal education ended, not because he had failed academically, since by every surviving account, he remained one of the sharpest students in his entire class, but because he had already decided, at an age when most of his peers were still simply trying to pass their exams, that ideas were never meant to stay confined to classrooms. They were meant to move people, to organize them, to act. And if the system he lived under would not tolerate even that small an assertion of political belief, then the system itself, in his eyes, was the problem that needed solving. It would be easy, looking back from the vantage point of everything Gaddafi eventually became, to treat this expulsion as a minor footnote, a schoolboy protest, quickly forgotten by everyone except the family embarrassed by it. But it was not forgotten, least of all by Gaddafi himself. It was the first time in his life that he had tested the boundary between conviction and consequence, and found that the state was willing to punish him for simply believing something too loudly, too publicly, at too young an age. That lesson, that the existing order would tolerate no real challenge to its authority, however small, however earnest, would harden, over the following decade, into an unshakable conviction. The only way to change anything meaningful in Libya was not to ask permission from the system that governed it, but to seize the machinery of the state itself, entirely, and rebuild it from the inside. He left Sabha carrying no diploma, no institutional credential of any kind, no letter of recommendation that might have opened doors elsewhere. What he carried instead was a fully formed political identity, assembled piece by piece over 19 years, the son of a colonized, humiliated family, shaped from infancy by the memory of a grandfather killed by Italian soldiers, sharpened through years of being looked down on in a classroom for his tribal origins and the tent his family called home, and finally set alight by the living example of a man in Cairo who had proven, beyond any theoretical doubt, that a young officer with sufficient conviction and sufficient nerve could topple a king and reshape an entire nation's destiny. The only thing Gaddafi lacked now was an army of his own to do it with. And for that, there was exactly one path left open to him in the Libya of the early 1960s. The same institution that trained the very officer class loyal to the monarchy he had already, quietly and privately, decided to destroy. He would have to walk through the front door of the system he despised to reach the moment when he could finally burn it down from within. The front door Gaddafi had to walk through was, at first, not a military one at all. In the immediate aftermath of his expulsion from Sabha, he enrolled at the University of Libya's campus in Benghazi, and for a while, it looked as though he might simply disappear into it, the way so many ambitious young men from poor backgrounds do, chasing a respectable credential, quietly setting aside the fire that had gotten him expelled from school only months earlier. According to most accounts, he registered to study either law or history. The historical record is genuinely inconsistent on this point, and Gaddafi himself was never especially interested in clarifying it later in life, since civilian university study was never truly where his ambitions lay. Whatever the exact course of study, it did not hold him for long. Benghazi in the early 1960s was, in its own way, a hotbed of exactly the kind of Arab nationalist ferment that had already captured Gaddafi's imagination back in Sabha, a port city with a long history of resistance to Italian colonization, home to a university whose lecture halls were increasingly filled with students debating Nasserism, Pan-Arabism, and the unfinished business of decolonization across the entire Middle East. Student groups met in coffee houses near the university to discuss articles smuggled in from Cairo, to argue over the relative merits of Nasser's socialism versus more conservative currents of Arab nationalism. And Gaddafi, by every account, threw himself into these informal debates with far more energy than he brought to his official coursework. But civilian academic life, with its slow accumulation of credentials and its distance from the actual machinery of power, could not compete with what Gaddafi had already concluded back in Sabha, that the people who genuinely changed a country did not do it from a lecture hall. They did it from the barracks, So he did something that, at the time, must have looked to his family like a strange and even reckless detour. He walked away from university study and enrolled instead at the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, sometime around 1963. On the surface, this looked like an act of conformity, even capitulation. The Libyan monarchy, after all, ran this academy. It trained the very officer corps whose job it was to defend King Idris I and the political order Gaddafi despised down to its foundations. To an outside observer, a worried parent, a skeptical former classmate, a poor Bedouin boy joining the king's military academy looked like a young man finally accepting his place within a system too large and too entrenched to fight. It was, in fact, the precise opposite. Gaddafi had understood something that revolutionaries across history, including Nasser's own free officers a decade earlier, had understood before him. If the only path to real, structural power in a country runs through its army, then the only way to seize that power is to first become one of the people trusted to command it. He was not joining the system his enemies had built. He was infiltrating it, patiently, from the inside, exactly where its guardians would least expect a threat to originate. The Academy's curriculum itself was, in another irony that later biographers would note, largely modelled on British military training traditions, complete with British-supplied instructors and equipment, a reminder that even the institution meant to produce loyal defenders of an independent Libyan monarchy remained, in its daily operation, deeply dependent on the same former colonial powers the monarchy claimed to have moved beyond. Cadets drilled with British pattern rifles, studied British tactical doctrine, and were graded, in some cases, by officers seconded directly from the British military mission still operating in the country. For a young man already primed to see every trace of foreign influence as a form of ongoing subordination, 4 years inside this environment functioned less like an education in loyal service and more like an extended, unintentional seminar in exactly how deeply colonial dependency could survive formal independence. Inside the academy, surrounded by the sons of families with military traditions stretching back generations, Gaddafi found something he had been missing his entire adolescence. Not a mentor exactly, and certainly not institutional approval, but a small peer group of young men who shared his precise combination of grievance and ambition. Fellow cadets, drawn disproportionately from similarly modest, often tribal backgrounds rather than the aristocratic families that had traditionally dominated Libya's officer corps, found in Gaddafi someone who could articulate, with a clarity startling for someone so young, exactly why the Libya they had grown up in was broken, and exactly what needed to replace it. Among this small circle was a fellow cadet named Abdul Salam Jaloud, a relationship formed in these academy years that would go on to define the next several decades of Libyan history. Jaloud, reportedly a fierce and physically imposing presence even as a young cadet, complemented Gaddafi's more contemplative intensity with a bluntness and organizational discipline that made the two men an effective pair from nearly the moment they met. He would become one of Gaddafi's closest and most trusted collaborators, effectively the second most powerful man in the country through much of the Revolutionary Command Council's early existence, and his loyalty on the single most consequential night of Gaddafi's life would prove entirely decisive. Together, this small circle of cadets began meeting in secret, in the hours between formal instruction and evening curfew, testing political ideas against one another, testing each other's nerve and discretion, and slowly assembling what would eventually be known as the Free Officers Movement, a name deliberately borrowed, almost as a direct homage, from the Egyptian free officers who had put Nasser in power a decade before. The choice of name was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. These young men wanted anyone who eventually discovered their existence to understand immediately and unmistakably what tradition they saw themselves continuing, and whose historical example they intended to follow to its logical conclusion. What makes this period so remarkable, viewed with the benefit of hindsight, is how patient the entire operation was. Gaddafi was not yet 25 years old, holding no meaningful rank and no formal authority of any kind, and yet he and his small circle of co-conspirators spent years, not months, years, quietly building a network of sympathetic officers, scattered deliberately across different units and different garrisons of the Libyan military, all while maintaining perfect, convincing outward loyalty to the very monarchy they intended, eventually, to destroy entirely. New members were recruited slowly, and only after extended observation, often over many months, since a single loose word to the wrong person could have ended the entire project, and several of the young officers involved, in front of a firing squad. This was not a hot-blooded uprising sketched out in a single furious summer of anger. It was a slow-motion infiltration, built cell by cell, conversation by careful conversation, inside an institution that had absolutely no idea it was quietly training and housing its own future executioners. Then, in a decision that history would later come to treat as almost darkly comic in its irony, the Libyan monarchy itself handed Gaddafi one of the most formative experiences of his young adult life. It sent him abroad for additional military training, first, according to several biographical accounts, for a period in Greece, and then, more significantly, for months of specialized training in Britain itself, likely connected to signals and communications instruction given his eventual posting. The exact administrative details of this posting vary slightly between different biographies, but the substance of the experience is remarkably consistent across nearly every account. Gaddafi spent an extended period immersed in the training programs of the very Western power whose lingering influence over Libya he had already come to consider corrosive to Arab dignity and Arab sovereignty alike. British instructors, by several accounts, found him a diligent and capable student, technically sharp but notably reserved socially, someone who kept careful distance from the informal camaraderie other foreign cadets sought with their hosts. He returned home having received, at the hands of these same instructors, an education not merely in military technique and communications procedure, but in exactly how a former colonial power still carried itself decades after formally relinquishing its empire. Its casual assumptions of cultural and technical superiority, its subtle condescension toward the very officers it was training to serve a country it had once occupied outright, its unspoken but unmistakable conviction that men like Gaddafi existed to be useful instruments of British and American strategic interests, rather than genuine equals in any partnership. If anything, the experience in Britain hardened Gaddafi rather than won him over, exactly as it had for so many other young men from the colonized and formerly colonized world who passed through Western military and educational institutions during this era, only to return home more radicalized, not less. He came back to Libya not impressed by the West's power and organization, but more convinced than ever that Arab nations, including his own, existed in a state of quiet, humiliating subordination to European and American powers, who had simply changed their methods since the era of formal colonization, trading direct territorial occupation for permanent military bases, exploitative economic arrangements, and diplomatic patronage that always, without exception. By 1965, or by some accounts 1966, Gaddafi graduated from the Royal Military Academy and was posted to the Signal Corps, Libya's military communications branch. It would be tempting to dismiss this posting as a minor administrative footnote, the kind of detail that means little to anyone outside a military logistics chart. In fact, it was an almost perfect assignment for a man quietly planning a coup. Signal Corps officers sat at the exact intersection of every military unit in the country, responsible for the flow of communications between garrisons, the transmission of orders up and down the chain of command, and the technical infrastructure behind every radio broadcast reaching the Libyan public. A young officer with ambitions to seize control of an entire nation in a single coordinated night could hardly have asked for a more strategically useful vantage point than one that placed him inside the very nervous system of Libya's armed forces, able to see, better than almost anyone else in the country, exactly how thinly stretched and poorly coordinated royal authority actually was outside the capital. While Gaddafi quietly climbed through the ranks, cultivating his network of sympathetic officers, unit by unit, garrison by garrison, the kingdom he was preparing to topple was rotting from within. And increasingly, this was a fact that was becoming difficult for anyone, foreign observer or ordinary Libyan citizen, to ignore. King Idris I, who had ruled Libya continuously since its independence in 1951, a man in his late 70s by the time Gaddafi entered the academy, and already showing signs of the fatigue that would eventually make him vulnerable to exactly the kind of surprise his rivals were planning, had never been a genuinely popular monarch so much as a cautiously tolerated one. An elderly, conservative ruler who had allied Libya closely with Britain and the United States from the very beginning of independence, Idris permitted the Americans to maintain Wheelus Air Base, one of the largest American military installations anywhere in the Middle East, on the outskirts of Tripoli, while granting British forces basing rights of their own. In the earliest, leanest years of independence, when Libya had almost no independent source of revenue and depended almost entirely on foreign aid simply to function as a state, this arrangement had brought Libya desperately needed foreign aid and a measure of stability the country had rarely known. But by the mid-1960s, everything had changed. In 1959, American oil companies operating in the Libyan desert struck oil at the Zelton field in significant commercial quantities, and within a few short years, Libya transformed with startling speed from one of the poorest countries on earth into a nation suddenly awash in petroleum wealth. That same arrangement with Western powers, which had once seemed a pragmatic necessity for national survival, began to look, to an entire rising generation of young Libyans, like something closer to ongoing national humiliation. A country selling its hard-won sovereignty and its newly discovered natural resources cheaply to the very Western powers it should, by rights, have been standing up to as an equal, now that it finally possessed the resources to do so. Corruption compounded the growing resentment. Libya's new oil wealth flowed disproportionately toward a narrow circle of families connected to the royal court in Tripoli, entrenching old patronage networks while ordinary Libyans, particularly those from tribal rural backgrounds like Gaddafi's own family, saw comparatively little tangible benefit from the resources being extracted from beneath the very soil their ancestors had lived on for generations. The monarchy, meanwhile, appeared increasingly disconnected from the currents of Arab nationalism sweeping across the wider region, a perception that curdled into something closer to open anger after 1967, when Israel's overwhelming, humiliating victory over Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the Six-Day War sent a wave of fury across the entire Arab world. Because King Idris's government maintained cordial, even warm relations with Western powers widely perceived across the region as having backed Israel, his administration found itself painted, fairly or not, with the same brush, perceived by an increasingly restless Libyan public as tacitly pro-Israeli, or at the very least, dangerously insufficient in its commitment to the Arab cause at precisely the moment that cause mattered most. Anti-Western riots broke out in both Tripoli and Benghazi. In an extraordinary act of grassroots political solidarity, Libyan oil workers shut down export terminals in protest, temporarily halting the very revenue stream the monarchy itself depended on to survive. By 1969, the tension building beneath the surface of Libyan society had become impossible to ignore, even for foreign intelligence services watching from a distance. The American Central Intelligence Agency had, by this point, begun anticipating that some faction within Libya's armed forces was likely to attempt a coup in the near future, though in one of the great, quietly absurd ironies of Cold War-era intelligence work, the CIA's attention was reportedly focused on an entirely different revolutionary faction, a group known informally as the Black Boots, rather than on the patient, disciplined network Gaddafi and his fellow free officers had spent years assembling right under everyone's nose, inside the very institution meant to guarantee the monarchy's survival. The kingdom, in other words, was ready to fall. It simply did not yet know with any precision who was actually going to be the one to push it. By the summer of 1969, Gaddafi and his circle understood that the opportunity they had spent years quietly preparing for was finally approaching, and understood, with real urgency, that they were almost certainly not the only faction who saw it coming. Rumors were spreading rapidly through Tripoli that King Idris, now aging and increasingly detached from day-to-day governance, might abdicate outright before the year was over. Other rumors, considerably more alarming to Gaddafi's small group, suggested that a rival faction, the Shalhi brothers, a powerful family with deep, long-standing ties to the royal court and to the traditional power base in Cyrenaica, whose patriarch had served as one of Idris's most trusted advisors for decades, were quietly preparing a British-backed coup of their own, one that would simply install a different set of established elites in place of the monarchy, without touching the underlying structure of privilege Gaddafi had spent his entire life resenting. For the free officers, this was the nightmare scenario made concrete. Years of patient, secret organizing could be rendered entirely meaningless in a single night, if a better connected, better resourced faction seized power first, restoring a slightly rearranged version of the same old order under new management, while men like Gaddafi and Jaloud were left exactly where they started, junior officers with nothing to show for years of risk, and very possibly facing exposure and execution once a rival faction consolidated its own control. If Gaddafi's group wanted to be the ones who actually determined what came next for Libya, they no longer had the luxury of waiting patiently for the perfect, fully prepared moment. They would have to move first, move fast, and move before anyone, the Shalhis, the British intelligence officers quietly advising them, or the aging king himself, recuperating obliviously at a foreign spa, realized precisely what was already in motion beneath their feet. The moment came on the last day of August 1969, and it came with an almost absurd stroke of luck. King Idris I was out of the country entirely, spending his summer between Turkey and Greece, receiving medical treatment for a leg ailment at a thermal spa in the Turkish city of Bursa. His nephew and designated crown prince, Sayyid Hassan ar-Rida, remained behind in Libya, but held nowhere near the authority, the loyalty networks, or the political instincts needed to respond quickly and decisively to a coordinated military move against the throne he was suddenly, unexpectedly responsible for defending. For a group of young officers who had spent years quietly building support inside barracks across the country while maintaining perfect outward loyalty to the crown, this absence was as close to an open door as they were ever likely to get. They gave their plan a name, Operation Jerusalem, a title chosen deliberately to signal, from the very first moment, exactly what tradition and what cause this coup was meant to serve. This was not framed, even in its planning stages, as a scramble for personal power among ambitious young officers. It was framed as an act of Arab nationalist restoration, a reclaiming of Libyan dignity in the same spirit that had animated Nasser's revolution in Egypt 17 years earlier. In the early hours of September 1st, 1969, the free officers moved simultaneously across Libya's two major cities, executing a plan that had been rehearsed mentally, if never physically, for years. In Tripoli and Benghazi, small, coordinated teams of soldiers seized airports, police depots, radio stations, and key government buildings, moving with a speed and coordination that suggested years of careful planning rather than a hastily improvised uprising thrown together in a matter of weeks. Gaddafi himself took personal command of the Burqa barracks in Benghazi, the very city that had, in so many ways, shaped his entire political education, first at its university and then at its military academy, and which would now become the launching point for the revolution he had spent nearly a decade quietly preparing. Meanwhile, Umar Muhaishi led the seizure of the Tripoli barracks, and Abdul Salam Jaloud, Gaddafi's closest ally since their academy days, the blunt, physically imposing officer who had complemented Gaddafi's more contemplative style from nearly the first day they met, took control of the capital's anti-aircraft batteries, neutralizing one of the very few resources that might have allowed loyalist forces to strike back from the air had they managed to organize any coherent resistance. What is genuinely remarkable about the coup, and what distinguishes it sharply from so many of the bloody power seizures that would follow elsewhere in the region over the coming decades, is how little blood was actually spilled that night. There was no siege of the royal palace, no mass arrests followed by executions in the streets, no prolonged gun battles between loyalist and revolutionary forces. The monarchy's support had eroded so completely over the preceding years, and the coup itself was executed with such surgical precision that any meaningful resistance essentially never had the chance to materialize. Crown Prince Hassan al-Rida, informed that the government he was meant to inherit no longer existed in any functional sense, announced his abdication over the radio within hours and was placed under house arrest without incident. King Idris, still abroad and now a monarch without a throne to return to, would never again set foot in Libya as its ruler. He would live out the remainder of his life in exile, first in Egypt and later in Greece, a footnote to a revolution he never saw coming and was never present to resist. By the end of that single day, the monarchy that had governed Libya since independence in 1951 simply ceased to exist. In its place stood a new entity, the Libyan Arab Republic, governed by a body calling itself the Revolutionary Command Council, or RCC, 12 officers in total, drawn almost entirely from the same small circle of free officers who had spent years plotting together in secret. And at the head of that council, at just 27 years old, stood a young officer with no formal political experience, no family wealth, no aristocratic lineage, nothing but years of patient organizing and an unshakable conviction that he had been right about everything since the day he was expelled from school in Sabha for the crime of caring too loudly about his country's dignity. Gaddafi promoted himself to the rank of colonel, a rank he would deliberately hold for the rest of his life, refusing every subsequent offer or expectation of a higher military title, in a calculated piece of populist theatre meant to signal that he considered himself a man of the people, rather than a self-styled general draped in medals and ceremonial rank. As chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council and commander-in-chief of Libya's armed forces, he now held more concentrated authority over an entire nation than anyone in his family's history had held in living memory, arguably in the tribe's entire recorded existence, stretching back generations. The international response to the coup revealed, almost immediately, exactly the kind of world Gaddafi believed himself to be up against. Representatives of what were then called the Four Powers, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union, moved quickly to establish diplomatic contact with the new Revolutionary Command Council, each government scrambling to assess what this untested group of young officers might mean for their own strategic interests in the region. Britain and the United States, in particular, extended formal diplomatic recognition with striking speed, motivated less by any genuine sympathy for the new government's revolutionary politics, and more by naked, practical self-interest. Both nations still maintained active military bases on Libyan soil, and both governments feared that prolonged political instability might threaten their continued access to Libya's oil reserves, or worse, open the door for expanded Soviet influence to fill whatever vacuum a chaotic transition might create. The Americans, in an attempt to build early goodwill with the untested young revolutionary now running the country, reportedly went so far as to warn Gaddafi directly of at least one counter-coup plot being organized against his fledgling government, a diplomatic gesture presumably intended to demonstrate that Washington could be a useful, even protective partner to the new regime, whatever ideological differences separated them. It did not work, and it was never going to. If anything, these overtures only confirmed for Gaddafi exactly what he had come to believe during his own training days in Britain years earlier, that Western powers approached small, resource-rich nations not as equals deserving of genuine partnership, but as strategic assets to be carefully managed and protected only for as long as doing so served their own broader interests. Gaddafi was determined, from his very first weeks in power, to reassert what he considered genuine Libyan sovereignty in every visible way available to him, and to expunge, his own word, repeated again and again in the early speeches broadcast to the nation after the coup, the lingering residue of foreign colonial and imperialist influence still embedded in his country's institutions, its economy, and its physical territory. Within months, he made that determination concrete. The American base at Wheelers Field, one of the largest United States military installations anywhere in the Middle East, and the accompanying British basing arrangements nearby, were both shut down entirely. Foreign troops given formal notice to withdraw from Libyan soil, their decades-long presence terminated by a government that had existed for less than a year. In 1970, Gaddafi went further still, expelling the remaining Italian settler community that had lingered in Libya since the colonial era. Families, in some cases, who had lived in the country for 2 or 3 generations, along with what remained of the country's small but historic Jewish community. Actions he framed publicly and repeatedly as a final settling of accounts with an era of foreign occupation that had, in his own family's living memory, cost his own grandfather his life, decades earlier. But consolidating a revolution, Gaddafi quickly discovered, required considerably more than simply expelling foreign powers and closing foreign bases. It required neutralizing threats from within his own ranks, and those threats materialized almost immediately, far sooner than the young Revolutionary Command Council might have hoped. In December 1969, only 3 months after the coup that had brought him to power so bloodlessly, Gaddafi's own intelligence services uncovered a counter-coup plot being organized against the new government, reportedly involving officers who felt sidelined by the new revolutionary leadership or who harbored their own ambitions for control. The response was swift and unambiguous, and it set a pattern that would define the rest of Gaddafi's rule. He moved to criminalize political dissent outright, formalizing laws that made organized opposition to the new government a serious, punishable offense. The same man who, as a 19-year-old, had been expelled from school for organizing an unauthorized political protest, now sat on the exact opposite side of that equation, the one deciding what political expression the state would and would not tolerate from its own citizens. Whether Gaddafi himself ever consciously registered this irony is a question none of his biographers have ever definitively answered. What is clear from the historical record is that he acted decisively and without hesitation, and that this early counter-coup attempt hardened, rather than softened, his instinct toward centralized, unchallenged personal control. With internal threats suppressed and foreign military bases emptied out, Gaddafi turned his attention to the resource that would ultimately fund everything he intended to build over the following decades: oil. Libya's petroleum reserves, discovered in significant commercial quantities only a decade earlier at the Zelton field, had already begun transforming the country's finances, even under the old monarchy. But foreign oil companies, overwhelmingly American and European in ownership, still controlled the terms of extraction and retained the overwhelming share of the resulting profits, leaving Libya itself with only a modest fraction of the wealth being pulled from beneath its own soil. Gaddafi moved methodically and with considerable technical sophistication for a government barely a year old to renegotiate these arrangements and gradually nationalize the country's oil production, using Libya's position as a critical supplier to Western Europe as direct leverage to extract far better financial terms than any other OPEC member nation had managed to secure at that point in time. Oil executives who had grown accustomed to negotiating from a position of overwhelming strength against compliant, dependent governments found themselves, for the first time, dealing with a Libyan government willing to simply shut off the flow of oil rather than accept unfavorable terms. A threat that, given Europe's heavy dependence on Libyan crude, carried genuine weight and forced concession after concession from companies used to dictating rather than negotiating. The revenue this generated for Libya was staggering, and Gaddafi, notably, did not hoard it the way so many of the region's other oil-rich rulers had chosen to do, channeling wealth instead into palaces, foreign investments, and the personal enrichment of a small ruling family. He funneled Libya's new oil wealth directly into social programs on a scale genuinely unusual for the era and the region alike. A comprehensive welfare system built essentially from scratch. Free healthcare extended to every Libyan citizen, regardless of tribal background or geographic location. Free education through university level for anyone capable of qualifying. And ambitious public housing projects specifically designed to move ordinary Libyans, particularly those from tribal rural backgrounds like his own, out of exactly the kind of poverty that had defined his own childhood in a goatskin tent near Sirte. For a significant portion of the Libyan population, particularly those who had seen little tangible benefit from the monarchy's oil wealth in the preceding decade, the early years of Gaddafi's rule genuinely delivered on the revolutionary promises made during and immediately after the coup. This is a detail worth sitting with carefully, because it is precisely what makes Gaddafi's story resist any easy moral categorization. The same man who would go on to become responsible for so much of what eventually horrified the wider world was also, in these formative early years, the genuine architect of some of the most significant and tangible material improvements ordinary Libyans had ever experienced in their lives. Yet even as he built this domestic foundation with real and measurable success, Gaddafi's ambitions were never confined merely to Libya's own borders, however transformed those borders now were. He saw himself, from the very beginning of his rule, as considerably more than the leader of a single nation. He saw himself as the natural, rightful inheritor of Nasser's unfinished project, the full political unification of the Arab world under revolutionary leadership. In December 1969, barely 3 months after seizing power, Gaddafi signed the Tripoli Charter alongside Egypt and Sudan, establishing what was formerly called the Arab Revolutionary Front, explicitly conceived, from its very first article, as a preliminary first step toward the eventual complete political unification of all three nations into a single Arab state. The following year, Syria announced its own intention to join this emerging bloc as well. For a brief, genuinely exhilarating moment, it must have seemed to Gaddafi that he stood on the verge of resurrecting, and perhaps even completing, the exact dream that had first captured his imagination as a 19-year-old organizing telegrams of solidarity from a schoolhouse in Sabha. Then, in September 1970, Nasser died suddenly of a heart attack, and the entire architecture of Gaddafi's pan-Arab ambitions lost its central, irreplaceable pillar overnight. Gaddafi played a highly visible, carefully staged role at Nasser's funeral in Cairo, positioning himself publicly and symbolically as the heir apparent to Nasser's legacy, the young revolutionary who would carry the torch of Arab unity forward, now that its original bearer was suddenly, unexpectedly gone. But Nasser's actual successor, Anwar Sadat, did not share Gaddafi's appetite for full, immediate political merger between sovereign Arab states. Sadat instead replaced the vision of a single unified state with a considerably looser political federation, formally implemented in April 1971. An arrangement that still saw Egypt, Syria and Sudan each receive substantial grants of Libyan oil money, even as the deeper political unification Gaddafi genuinely wanted kept receding further and further out of reach with each passing year. In February 1972, Gaddafi and Sadat did sign an unofficial charter aiming at full merger between Egypt and Libya specifically. But relations between the two men deteriorated sharply over the following year, and the September 1973 deadline set for implementing even this looser federation passed with no meaningful action taken at all, quietly abandoned by both sides. By the mid-1970s, Gaddafi's repeated attempts to translate Nasser's legacy into a concrete, lasting political union had failed decisively with Egypt and Sudan, had failed just as decisively with Syria, and would go on to fail yet again with Tunisia in 1974. Each collapse followed a strikingly similar pattern: initial enthusiasm and grand public declarations, followed by a slow, quiet unraveling as other Arab leaders proved consistently unwilling to subordinate their own national sovereignty and their own political systems to a union increasingly built around Gaddafi's personal vision rather than any genuine collective consensus among equals. It would have been entirely reasonable, at this point in his career, for a more conventional leader to scale back his ambitions considerably, to settle into the quieter, more modest work of simply governing Libya alone. Gaddafi did precisely the opposite. If Arab unity through formal negotiation and diplomacy kept failing him again and again, he would simply redirect that same revolutionary energy and Libya's now genuinely enormous oil wealth toward a different and considerably more dangerous kind of project altogether. If Gaddafi could not unify the Arab world through treaties and charters, he decided he would attempt something far more ambitious and considerably more radical. He would rewrite the very rules by which nations were supposed to be governed at all, and offer his own philosophy as a model not merely for Libya, but for the entire developing post-colonial world to follow. In 1973, he formally declared the beginning of what he called the Popular Revolution, the second stage of the transformation he had promised the country since the very first radio broadcast announcing the coup back in 1969. The first stage, the period governed directly by the Revolutionary Command Council, had been about seizing power and securing it against internal and external threats alike, a phase that by Gaddafi's own account had run its course and needed to give way to something more permanent than rule by a council of former army officers. This second stage was about something far more sweeping and, in its own way, far stranger. Dismantling the conventional machinery of the state itself and replacing it with what Gaddafi insisted, with genuine conviction, was a purer, more authentic form of direct popular rule than any democracy the West had ever produced, one that owed nothing to the parliamentary traditions of the very colonial powers he had spent his entire adult life resisting. Between 1975 and 1979, Gaddafi published his political testament in 3 separate volumes, collectively known as the Green Book. The first volume, subtitled The Solution of the Problem of Democracy, laid out his core argument that parliamentary systems and political parties were themselves fraudulent, mechanisms that gave the appearance of popular representation while actually concentrating power in the hands of whichever faction won a temporary majority, leaving everyone who voted for the losing side effectively unrepresented for years at a time. In its place, Gaddafi proposed a pyramid of basic people's congresses, feeding upward into a general people's congress, that he claimed allowed every citizen to participate directly in lawmaking, rather than delegating that power to professional politicians who could be bought, corrupted, or simply disconnected from the people they claimed to represent. The second volume turned to economics, arguing that wage labor itself was a disguised form of slavery, since a worker who depends entirely on a wage for survival is never truly free to refuse unjust terms. Gaddafi proposed instead a system in which workers would become partners or participants in production rather than employees selling their labor for a fixed wage, a doctrine used in practice to justify sweeping nationalizations across nearly every sector of the Libyan economy, from banking and retail trade to real estate and even small family businesses, many of which were simply absorbed into state-run cooperatives almost overnight, with little warning and less compensation for the owners who lost them. The third volume, published last, addressed what Gaddafi called the social basis of his third universal theory, touching on the family, tribalism, and the role of women in Libyan society, in terms that mixed genuinely progressive positions, support for women's education, women's employment, and even Gaddafi's own creation of a female personal bodyguard corps, at a time when this was almost unthinkable elsewhere in the region, with deeply conservative assumptions about the family as the unshakable foundational unit of the state, and about a woman's role within that family as ultimately subordinate to it. Taken together, the 3 volumes proposed a framework Gaddafi called the Third Universal Theory, presented, with his usual self-confidence, as a genuine alternative to both of the 20th century's dominant ideological blocs, one that would supposedly succeed where both capitalism and communism had already failed the ordinary citizens living under them. Capitalism, in Gaddafi's own analysis, inevitably concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a narrow corporate elite, reducing ordinary working people to instruments of someone else's profit margins. Marxism, which he might reasonably have been expected to embrace given his revolutionary credentials and his openly socialist economic policies, fared no better in his written analysis. He rejected it just as forcefully and just as completely, arguing that it merely replaced one exploiting class with another, substituting the tyranny of an unaccountable market for the equally suffocating tyranny of an unaccountable party bureaucrat answering to no one but himself. In 1977, he gave the resulting political system a name that would define Libya for the rest of his life and the entirety of his rule, the Jamahiriya, a term he coined himself by combining existing Arabic words, roughly translating to state of the masses. Gaddafi adopted a personal title to match this new system, brother leader and guide of the revolution, holding no formal government position at all going forward, even as every meaningful lever of actual power in the country remained, in daily practice, entirely and exclusively under his own personal control. It was a brilliant piece of political theatre, one that would genuinely frustrate Western diplomats trying to map Libya's real chain of command for decades to come, since on paper there was often no one clearly identifiable to negotiate with at all. Foreign officials seeking to discuss oil contracts or diplomatic disputes frequently found themselves redirected from one committee to another, each claiming only partial authority, while the man who actually made every consequential decision in the country held no title that obliged him to sit at the table at all. The Green Book was not confined to Libya's borders either. Gaddafi poured considerable resources into translating and distributing the text internationally, establishing Green Book study centers in a number of African and Middle Eastern capitals, and funding sympathetic academics and student groups abroad, willing to teach the Third Universal Theory as a serious alternative to Cold War orthodoxy. Few of these efforts produced lasting intellectual influence outside Libya itself, but they reflected something genuine about how Gaddafi understood his own historical role, not merely as the ruler of one desert nation, but as the author of an idea he sincerely believed the rest of the post-colonial world was waiting to discover. This same ideological project also had a considerably darker domestic face, one the Green Book's abstract language about popular committees tended to obscure entirely from outside observers. Beginning in the late 1970s, Gaddafi authorized the formation of so-called revolutionary committees, semi-official bodies tasked with enforcing ideological conformity at the neighborhood level, monitoring universities, workplaces, and even individual households for any signs of dissent against the revolution or its leader. Students accused of harboring opposition sympathies were expelled from their universities or, in a number of well-documented cases, publicly executed in university courtyards in front of their classmates, their deaths broadcast afterward on state television as a deliberate deterrent to anyone else who might consider stepping out of line. It was a level of domestic repression that sat uneasily, to say the least, alongside the Green Book's repeated claims to have created history's most authentic and direct form of popular democracy anywhere on Earth. With his domestic ideology now fully articulated across 3 published volumes, and his oil revenues continuing to swell Libya's treasury year after year, Gaddafi turned his energy outward once again. Libya's leverage over the West had already been demonstrated dramatically during the 1973 Arab oil embargo, when Libya joined other Arab OPEC members in cutting off exports to the United States and other supporters of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, briefly helping to quadruple global oil prices and giving Gaddafi a vivid, first-hand taste of just how much economic power a comparatively small desert nation could wield once it controlled a resource the industrialized world simply could not do without. Having concluded that formal political unification with other established Arab governments was fundamentally a dead end, he now pursued a different and far more provocative strategy, funding revolutionary and militant movements directly, wherever in the world he found a cause that fit his own self-image as a global champion of the oppressed, standing against imperial power. The scope of this campaign was genuinely staggering in its geographic range. The Provisional Irish Republican Army received substantial Libyan support in its long campaign against British rule in Northern Ireland, including, according to later investigations, direct shipments of weapons and explosives that would go on to fuel years of continued violence. A partnership Gaddafi maintained for years, partly as calculated, personal retaliation against Britain, the very same power that had trained him as a young officer and whose lingering colonial habits he had never forgiven. The Palestine Liberation Organization received both significant financial backing and enthusiastic rhetorical championing from Tripoli, with Gaddafi positioning himself repeatedly as one of the Palestinian cause's most vocal international advocates on the world stage. The African National Congress, fighting the entrenched apartheid regime in South Africa, received meaningful Libyan assistance at a time when much of the Western world, including the government of the United States, still officially treated Nelson Mandela's movement with deep suspicion. Libya also opened training camps that over the years hosted militants from movements as geographically scattered as the Philippines, the Basque region of Spain, and several West African insurgencies, a genuinely global network of patronage, assembled and funded almost entirely at Gaddafi's own personal direction, with little oversight from anyone else in his government. The sheer variety of causes Gaddafi chose to bankroll reveals just how loosely he applied his own stated principle of anti-imperial solidarity. Some recipients, like the ANC, were fighting a system, apartheid, that history would later judge almost universally as an unambiguous moral evil, and Libyan support for Mandela's movement is remembered today, even by many of Gaddafi's harshest critics, as one of the more defensible uses of his oil wealth. Other recipients were considerably harder to justify under any anti-colonial framework at all. Armed separatist factions with only the thinnest rhetorical connection to liberation from empire, funded seemingly because they were willing to accept Libyan money and Libyan weapons, and because their existence caused inconvenience to governments Gaddafi personally resented. Intelligence services in Washington, London, and Paris spent years simply trying to catalogue the full extent of these relationships, several of which were only confirmed decades later, long after the Cold War itself had ended. Not every one of Gaddafi's foreign ventures during this period was funded quietly from a safe distance. The long war in neighbouring Chad, stretching across much of the 1970s and 1980s, saw direct and sustained Libyan military commitment in pursuit of the mineral-rich Aouzou Strip along the two countries' shared border, and in service of Gaddafi's considerably broader ambition to extend his personal influence deep into sub-Saharan Africa. The campaign dragged on inconclusively for years, through shifting alliances and repeated offensives, consuming enormous quantities of Libyan money, sophisticated Soviet-supplied equipment, and the lives of thousands of Libyan soldiers, without ever delivering the decisive outcome Gaddafi had originally envisioned. At various points, Libya backed rival Chadian factions against one another as the political situation shifted, occupied the Aouzou Strip outright, and even briefly saw Libyan-backed forces install a friendlier government in the Chadian capital, only to watch that advantage evaporate as French forces intervened repeatedly on behalf of Chad's internationally recognized government, determined not to let their former African colony fall entirely under Libyan influence. By the time a final ceasefire was reached in the late 1980s, followed years later by an international court of justice ruling that firmly rejected Libya's territorial claim to the Aouzou Strip altogether, Gaddafi had spent more than a decade and an enormous fortune in exchange for essentially nothing: no territory gained, no lasting client government installed, and a Libyan military considerably weaker and more depleted than when the war had begun. It stands, in retrospect, as one of the clearest examples of a pattern that would recur throughout his rule. Grand ambition, real resources committed without hesitation, and a final result that fell dramatically short. It was against this backdrop that Gaddafi's relationship with the United States curdled decisively into open hostility, particularly after Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981. Reagan's administration viewed Libya through a distinctly Cold War lens, a perception Gaddafi did little to discourage, visiting Moscow repeatedly through the early and mid-1980s, and even floating, at moments of maximum tension, the provocative idea that Libya might formally align itself with the Warsaw Pact. The mounting friction escalated into direct military confrontation in August 1981, when American forces shot down 2 Libyan jets over the disputed Gulf of Sirte, and again in December 1981, when the White House publicly accused Gaddafi of dispatching a trained assassination squad specifically to kill Reagan himself. Matters worsened further still through the mid-1980s. In December 1985, coordinated gun and grenade attacks at the Rome and Vienna airports, carried out by operatives of the Palestinian militant group Abu Nidal, killed 19 people and wounded well over 100 more, striking travelers waiting in line at check-in counters just days before Christmas. American officials pointed directly to Libyan sponsorship of the group behind the attack, citing intelligence linking Abu Nidal's operations to funding and safe haven provided by Tripoli. Gaddafi neither confirmed nor meaningfully denied the connection, and in public statements around this period, he spoke with evident approval of what he called legitimate armed resistance against Western and Israeli targets, blurring, deliberately or not, the line between support for national liberation movements and support for indiscriminate attacks on civilians that most of the world simply called terrorism. Then, in April 1986, a bomb ripped through a West Berlin discotheque known to be frequented by American servicemen stationed in Germany, killing 3 people outright, including 2 US soldiers, and wounding dozens more in the blast. American intelligence agencies quickly attributed the attack to Libyan agents operating in Europe, and Reagan, having already concluded that diplomatic pressure alone would never meaningfully restrain Gaddafi's behavior, answered this time with direct, overwhelming military force, ordering coordinated airstrikes against multiple targets across Libya, including, in a detail that would haunt the operation for decades afterward, Gaddafi's own residential compound in Tripoli, where his young adopted infant daughter was reportedly killed in the bombing raid. The April 1986 raid, codenamed Operation El Dorado Canyon by American planners, involved dozens of US Air Force and Navy aircraft launched from bases in Britain and carriers in the Mediterranean, and remains, to this day, one of the most direct military strikes any American president has ever ordered against the personal residence of a foreign head of state. Reagan defended the operation publicly as a legitimate act of self-defense against a proven state sponsor of terrorism, while Gaddafi's government characterized it as attempted state assassination and a flagrant violation of international law. European allies were sharply divided on the raid's legitimacy, with France and Spain notably refusing to grant overflight rights to the American bombers, forcing a longer and more dangerous flight path around the Iberian Peninsula, an early sign of the transatlantic friction that Gaddafi's antagonism toward Washington would continue to generate among America's own allies for years afterward. By the late 1980s, then, Gaddafi's international standing was moving in only one clear direction, further and further outside the boundaries of what Western governments considered an acceptable actor on the world stage. he had been bombed by the American military inside his own capital city. He had been publicly accused of plotting to assassinate a sitting American president. He had built, through years of funding militants across multiple continents simultaneously, a reputation as perhaps the single most consequential state sponsor of political violence found anywhere in the world at that time. And yet nothing that had happened so far in his long and eventful rule, not the grinding war in Chad, not the direct military confrontation over the Gulf of Sirte, not even the American bombing of his own home and the death of his own child, would come close to matching the sheer scale of the catastrophe about to unfold, without warning, over the dark December skies of a small, unremarkable town in Scotland, just 2 years later. On the evening of December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 lifted off from London's Heathrow Airport, bound for New York, carrying 243 passengers and 16 crew members, many of them American college students flying home for the Christmas holidays after a semester studying abroad in Europe, along with several U.S. military personnel and Foreign Service families returning stateside. Just after 7 o'clock that evening, as the Boeing 747 named Clipper Maid of the Seas cruised at altitude over the Scottish border town of Lockerbie, a bomb concealed inside a cassette player packed into a suitcase in the cargo hold detonated, tearing the aircraft apart in mid-air with almost no warning to anyone aboard. Investigators would later determine that the explosive device had traveled through at least 2 connecting flights before reaching Heathrow, routed through Malta and Frankfurt in a chain of unaccompanied baggage transfers that exploited exactly the kind of security gaps international aviation would spend the following decade working to close. Large sections of the fuselage crashed directly into a residential street in Lockerbie itself, obliterating homes and killing 11 people on the ground, who had no connection to the flight whatsoever. An entire street reduced, within seconds, to burning wreckage and debris, in scenes that residents and emergency responders would describe for years afterward as something closer to a war zone than a peaceful market town on a quiet December evening. Every single person aboard the aircraft died. With 270 people killed in total, it remains to this day the deadliest terrorist attack ever carried out on British soil, and one of the deadliest in the history of European aviation altogether. The investigation that followed was long, painstaking, and ultimately conclusive in ways that would define the next 15 years of Gaddafi's relationship with the wider world. A joint effort between Scottish police, the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary, and the American FBI eventually pieced together fragments of the bomb's timer mechanism recovered from the crash site. A search that involved combing an area of Scottish countryside spanning roughly 845 square miles for debris, some of it scattered dozens of miles from the main crash site by the force of the explosion and the winds at cruising altitude. Investigators traced the timer's manufacture to a Swiss electronics firm that had supplied similar devices to Libyan intelligence in the past, and further traced the suitcase believed to have carried the bomb back to Malta, where clothing fragments recovered from the wreckage were matched to purchases made at a small shop whose owner would later provide crucial, if imperfect, testimony identifying one of the eventual suspects. In November 1991, arrest warrants were issued for 2 Libyan nationals, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fhima, both identified as officers of Libya's Mukhabarat el-Jamahiriya, the country's foreign intelligence service, with al-Megrahi in particular alleged to have served as the service's head of security for Libyan Arab Airlines, a position investigators believed gave him direct access to the airline logistics and unaccompanied baggage systems needed to place a bomb aboard an interline flight, without ever personally boarding the aircraft himself. Gaddafi's response was flat refusal. For years, he declined to hand over either suspect for trial, treating the demand as an assault on Libyan sovereignty rather than a legitimate request tied to the deaths of 270 people, and insisting publicly that Libya could not be expected to extradite its own citizens to face trial in the courts of nations he considered hostile to Libyan interests. The international community's patience did not last. In 1992, the United Nations Security Council imposed comprehensive economic sanctions on Libya, cutting the country off from international air travel, arms sales, and a significant portion of its international financial dealings, a punishment that would grind on, tightening further in 1993 for the better part of a decade, isolating Libya's economy and its people from much of the outside world. The Lockerbie bombing did not stand alone as evidence of Libyan state terrorism in the eyes of Western governments. Libya was also widely blamed for the September 1989 bombing of UTA Flight 772, a French passenger jet that exploded over the Tenere desert region of Niger, killing all 170 people aboard, including passengers of more than a dozen nationalities. A second act of mass casualty aviation terrorism attributed to the same intelligence apparatus, compounding Libya's isolation and removing any lingering doubt in the minds of Western intelligence agencies that Gaddafi's government was willing to use indiscriminate violence against civilians as a routine instrument of state policy, rather than an isolated aberration. A French court would later convict 6 Libyan officials in absentia for the UTA bombing, running a parallel track of legal accountability alongside the Lockerbie case that added further diplomatic pressure on Tripoli throughout the 1990s. Domestically, meanwhile, the image of Gaddafi as an untouchable, all-powerful ruler was proving considerably less airtight than it appeared from the outside looking in. In 1993, and again in 1996, Gaddafi survived assassination attempts organized by armed militant factions inside Libya itself, some reportedly linked to Islamist opposition groups operating clandestinely in the country's eastern regions, particularly around Benghazi and the mountainous Cyrenaican interior, where resistance to central authority had deep historical roots, stretching back to the anti-colonial insurgency of Omar Mukhtar decades earlier. Libyan state media, unsurprisingly, gave these incidents little coverage, and for years the outside world knew only fragments of what had actually occurred. Accounts pieced together later from defectors and foreign intelligence services suggested at least one attempt involved gunfire directed at Gaddafi's motorcade, while another was reportedly foiled only through last-minute intelligence tips from within his own inner circle. These episodes served as a persistent, uncomfortable reminder that even at the height of his international notoriety, his grip on power at home was not without cracks, dissent, and enemies willing to risk near-certain death if caught, to remove him from power. For years, the standoff over Lockerbie ground on with no resolution in sight, sanctions biting deeper into an already struggling Libyan economy, Gaddafi refusing to yield on a matter he framed as one of national dignity, and the families of 270 victims left without any measure of justice or accountability, many of them traveling repeatedly to international forums and media outlets to keep pressure on both Tripoli and their own governments. The human cost of the sanctions regime inside Libya itself, meanwhile, received considerably less international attention than the diplomatic standoff generating the headlines, with air travel largely cut off. Ordinary Libyans requiring specialized medical treatment abroad faced grueling overland journeys by car or bus to neighboring Tunisia or Egypt simply to reach an airport still permitted to serve international flights. A hardship Gaddafi's government was quick to publicize as evidence of Western cruelty, even as it declined to meet the international community's core demand that might have ended the suffering years earlier. It was not until 1999, after years of painstaking diplomatic negotiation, much of it conducted quietly through intermediaries including Nelson Mandela, who took a personal interest in brokering a resolution, that Gaddafi finally agreed to hand over the two accused men. Mandela's involvement carried particular symbolic weight. Here was a man who had spent nearly 3 decades in prison for resisting an unjust system, now serving as South Africa's first democratically elected president, personally travelling to Tripoli to persuade Gaddafi that continued defiance served no one, least of all the Libyan people bearing the daily cost of sanctions. Mandela reportedly appealed to Gaddafi's own self-image as a champion of the developing world, arguing that Libya's continued isolation only weakened the broader cause of African and Arab solidarity Gaddafi claimed to represent, while offering guarantees that the two suspects would be tried under conditions Libya could accept as fair. Al-Megrahi and Fima were surrendered for trial at Camp Zeist, a specially designated Scottish court convened, unusually, on Dutch soil at a former US airbase in the Netherlands, a legal arrangement designed specifically to satisfy Libyan objections to trying its citizens on British territory, while still allowing Scottish judges to preside under Scottish law. The trial itself ran for many months, hearing testimony from witnesses across multiple countries, forensic experts who reconstructed the bomb's timer mechanism piece by piece from wreckage scattered across the Scottish countryside, and intelligence officials who described years of surveillance on Libyan operatives in Malta, where investigators believed the bomb-laden suitcase had first entered the aviation system. The trial concluded in January 2001 with Fima's acquittal and Al-Megrahi's conviction, sentencing him to life imprisonment. A verdict that satisfied almost no one entirely, leaving unresolved questions about the full extent of Libyan state involvement and about whether Al-Megrahi had acted alone or as part of a larger conspiracy hanging over the case for decades to come. Al-Megrahi himself would later be released in 2009 on compassionate grounds after being diagnosed with terminal cancer, returning to Libya to a hero's welcome that reignited outrage among victims' families and cast a long shadow over the entire rapprochement that had by then already unfolded between Libya and the West. Handing over the suspects, however, was only a partial concession. It addressed the legal mechanics of the case without resolving Libya's broader status as an international pariah state, still under sanctions, and still largely frozen out of normal diplomatic and commercial relations with the West. The real turning point, the moment that would transform Gaddafi almost overnight from global outcast to courted statesman, came 2 years later, in 2003. That year, in a carefully choreographed diplomatic sequence negotiated in painstaking secrecy over many months, Libya formally accepted responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing, while conspicuously stopping short of admitting criminal guilt in any legal sense, and agreed to pay $2.7 billion in compensation to the families of the 270 victims, a sum structured to be paid out in installments tied explicitly to the progressive lifting of sanctions. In the very same year, in a move that stunned observers who had spent decades treating Gaddafi as one of the world's most dangerous and unpredictable actors, Libya announced that it was voluntarily dismantling its entire weapons of mass destruction program, decommissioning chemical weapons stockpiles under international verification, and abandoning what had been, by several Western intelligence assessments, a serious and considerably more advanced nuclear ambitions program than most analysts had previously believed. The timing was not coincidental. Libya's dramatic about-face came just months after the American-led invasion of Iraq, toppled Saddam Hussein's government. And many analysts have since concluded that Gaddafi, watching a fellow Arab strongman's regime collapse under the weight of direct Western military intervention, calculated that voluntary compliance with international demands was a considerably safer long-term path than risking becoming the next target on Washington's list of regimes suspected of harboring weapons of mass destruction. American and British intelligence teams were subsequently permitted extraordinary access inside Libya, touring previously secret facilities and cataloguing centrifuge components, chemical precursor stockpiles, and design documents that, according to officials briefed on the program at the time, revealed Libya's nuclear ambitions to have progressed further than most outside assessments had previously believed. A genuinely alarming discovery that, paradoxically, only reinforced Western governments' relief that Gaddafi had chosen negotiation over concealment. Whatever his precise motivations, the strategic bet paid off immediately and rather spectacularly. The consequences arrived with head-spinning speed. The United Nations formally lifted its sanctions against Libya. Relations between Tripoli and Washington, frozen in mutual hostility since the Reagan-era bombing campaign nearly 2 decades earlier, began thawing at a pace that would have seemed genuinely unthinkable only a few years before. Diplomatic relations between the United States and Libya, severed since 1980, were formally restored in 2006, and Libya was removed from the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism that same year, a designation that had shaped nearly every aspect of Libya's isolation for over 2 decades. American oil companies, many of which had been forced to abandon lucrative Libyan concessions under sanctions, began quietly returning to negotiate new exploration and production agreements, eager not to be left behind as European competitors moved swiftly to secure their own footholds in a market suddenly reopened after years of enforced absence. And in March 2004, in perhaps the single most symbolically loaded image of Gaddafi's entire post-Lockerbie rehabilitation, British Prime Minister Tony Blair travelled personally to Libya and shook Gaddafi's hand inside his own compound near Tripoli. The same leader once labelled the mad dog of the Middle East by an American president, now being embraced by a sitting British Prime Minister as a partner in what Blair characterised publicly as a new era of cooperation, one that conveniently coincided with major new oil and gas exploration agreements signed between Libya and British energy companies, including Shell, during the very same visit. Critics on both sides of the Atlantic were quick to note the timing, suggesting that whatever moral or security rationale was offered publicly for Libya's rehabilitation, the commercial incentives at play were considerably more straightforward. A country holding some of Africa's largest proven oil reserves, freshly reopened for business after more than a decade of enforced absence, represented an opportunity few Western governments or their energy companies were willing to leave entirely to their competitors. What followed was, by any measure, the most extraordinary run of international rehabilitation Gaddafi would ever experience in his long career. Having spent much of his political life styling himself as the champion of Arab unity, only to watch that project collapse repeatedly through the 1970s and 1980s, he now pivoted his ambitions southward, positioning Libya, and himself personally, as a leading voice for African unity instead, funding infrastructure projects, satellite communications initiatives, and diplomatic summits across the continent, with the same enthusiasm he had once reserved for pan-Arab causes, decades earlier. He floated proposals for a United States of Africa, complete with a single continental currency, a unified African military command, and a single African passport. Grand, sweeping visions reminiscent of exactly the kind of pan-Arab unification schemes that had failed him so many times before, now simply redirected toward a new continental audience, many of whose leaders found themselves flattered, bemused, or exasperated in roughly equal measure by his relentless enthusiasm. In February 2009, that pivot reached its formal culmination when Gaddafi was elected chairperson of the African Union, a role he held until early 2010, presiding over the 54-member continental body as one of its most prominent, if idiosyncratic, statesmen, famously arriving at summit meetings with a retinue that dwarfed those of every other head of state present, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, complete with his own security detail, his personal tent, and an entourage of ministers, translators, and hangers-on that overwhelmed the logistical capacity of host cities, accustomed to considerably more modest diplomatic delegations. That same year, he delivered his first address before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, the same institution whose sanctions had strangled his economy for over a decade, now speaking as a legitimized head of state rather than an isolated pariah, in a rambling speech that ran vastly over its allotted 15 minutes, stretching past 90, and touched on subjects ranging from the assassination of John F. Kennedy to the origins of swine flu, to his proposal that the UN headquarters itself be relocated away from New York to a more geographically neutral location, all delivered while occasionally tearing pages from a printed copy of the UN Charter and tossing them toward the assembled delegates as a piece of live theatrical protest against what he considered the institution's fundamentally undemocratic structure. It was during this period, roughly between 2003 and 2010, that the image introduced at the very beginning of this story took shape in full. The elaborate Bedouin tent, flown across continents at enormous expense and pitched outside the residences and government buildings of the very Western capitals that had once treated Libya as an outlaw state: Paris, Rome, Moscow. Each appearance a carefully staged reminder that Gaddafi refused to abandon the desert identity of his childhood, even as he was welcomed with the full ceremonial trappings reserved for heads of state, and even as his hosts, increasingly dependent on Libyan oil and eager for lucrative contracts, indulged eccentricities that would once have been unthinkable to accommodate for a man so recently classified as a terrorist sponsor. To watch Gaddafi in these years, dining with European heads of state, chairing continental summits in Addis Ababa, addressing the United Nations General Assembly in New York, courted by the same American administration that had once bombed his home, was to witness one of the more remarkable second acts in modern political history. A man once bombed by the American military, once accused of plotting to assassinate a sitting US president, once responsible for one of the deadliest acts of terrorism ever committed on British soil, now standing as an accepted, even actively courted, member of the very international order he had spent decades of his life trying to undermine and reshape. But rehabilitation, however genuine and however lucrative it appeared on the surface to Western governments eager for Libyan oil contracts, had not changed the fundamental character of the regime underneath it in any meaningful way. 42 years of absolute, unchallenged personal rule had left Libya's political institutions almost entirely hollow, its organized opposition suppressed or driven into exile, its enormous oil wealth concentrated in the hands of Gaddafi's family and a small circle of loyalists, and its future entirely dependent on the health, judgment, and continued survival of one increasingly isolated and eccentric man, now approaching 70 years of age. Political parties remained banned, independent media remained essentially non-existent, with state television serving primarily as a vehicle for Gaddafi's own lengthy, unscripted addresses to the nation. The revolutionary committees that had terrorized dissidents in the 1970s and 1980s had softened in visibility, but never fully disappeared. And human rights organizations continued to document arbitrary detentions, disappearances, and the absence of any meaningful judicial independence throughout this entire period of apparent international rehabilitation. Libya's new Western partners, by and large, chose not to look too closely at any of this, so long as the oil kept flowing and the more theatrical excesses of their newly rehabilitated partner could be tolerated as colorful eccentricity rather than examined as symptoms of something considerably darker underneath the surface. Gaddafi's own family, meanwhile, had become deeply enmeshed in the machinery of the state during these same rehabilitation years, in ways that would prove significant once his rule began to crack. His son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, educated in London and fluent in the language of Western-style economic reform, had emerged as an increasingly visible public face for the regime, giving interviews to foreign journalists in which he spoke, with apparent sincerity, of gradual political liberalization and constitutional reform, promises that a considerable number of Western observers chose to take at face value, reading in Saif's Western education and polished English, a signal that Libya's younger generation of leadership might eventually steer the country toward a genuinely different future than his father's 4 decades of absolute rule had allowed. Other sons occupied positions of military and economic influence throughout the security services and state-owned enterprises, creating a family-centered power structure that left remarkably little institutional space for any alternative leadership to develop, whether reformist or otherwise, inside the country's formal structures of government. And halfway across North Africa, in a country that had inspired so much of Gaddafi's own political imagination as a teenager listening to Nasser's broadcasts decades earlier, forces were already gathering that would prove far more dangerous to him than any American president, any UN sanctions regime, or any accusation of state-sponsored terrorism ever had. The forces that would end Gaddafi's 42 years in power did not begin in Libya at all. They began next door, in Tunisia, in December 2010, when a street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in protest against police harassment and the daily humiliations of unemployment. An act of desperation that ignited a wave of protest, toppling President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali within weeks. A collapse so sudden and so complete that it stunned every long-entrenched ruler across the Arab world, few of whom had imagined that decades of seemingly permanent authoritarian rule could unravel in a matter of days once ordinary citizens concluded that fear of the state no longer outweighed their desperation. Then, in February 2011, the unrest spread to Egypt, and Hosni Mubarak, who had ruled for nearly 30 years with the backing of a security apparatus considered among the most formidable in the region, was forced from office after less than 3 weeks of sustained popular protest, concentrated in Cairo's Tahrir Square, broadcast live to television screens across the entire Arab world. Gaddafi watched both collapses unfold from Tripoli, and by every available account, concluded that Libya was different. He had, after all, spent decades building a system he genuinely believed was more directly connected to ordinary Libyans than any conventional government. The committees, the congresses, the whole architecture of the Jamahiriya that supposedly made him merely a brother leader rather than a ruler in any formal sense. In public remarks made as the unrest spread across the region, he dismissed the idea that Libyans had any real grievance against a government that had, by his own account, already handed power directly to the people decades earlier, framing the very possibility of protest in Libya as evidence of foreign meddling rather than genuine domestic discontent. In his own understanding of his legacy, he had already given the Libyan people what protesters in Tunisia and Egypt were still fighting for. He did not believe the same fire could spread to his own country. He was wrong, and the fire reached Benghazi within days. In mid-February 2011, protests erupted in Libya's second city, the same city where, 42 years earlier, a 27-year-old Gaddafi had personally led the seizure of the Berka barracks that launched his own revolution. The grievances driving the 2011 protests were, in their broad strokes, painfully familiar. Corruption, chronic unemployment among a young population that oil wealth had never fully absorbed into productive work, and a political system that offered no legitimate channel for dissent after 4 decades of a single man's absolute rule. Gaddafi's response was immediate and severe. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators, and the death toll climbed quickly enough that what began as protest hardened, within days, into armed rebellion. By late February, opposition figures had formed the National Transitional Council, based in Benghazi, positioning itself as an alternative government and a rallying point for the growing number of Libyans, including significant portions of the military, who were abandoning Gaddafi's regime outright. What followed was not a quick collapse, but a grinding civil war, and it was internationalized with remarkable speed, citing the risk of a large-scale massacre in Benghazi as government forces advanced to retake the rebel stronghold, and invoking the doctrine of the responsibility to protect that had gained increasing traction in international law over the preceding decade. The United Nations Security Council authorized international military action to protect Libyan civilians in Resolution 1973, passed in March 2011, with 10 votes in favor and 5 abstentions, including Russia and China, neither of which chose to exercise its veto. NATO forces began an air campaign shortly afterward, systematically degrading Gaddafi's military capacity, his air defenses, his armor, his command infrastructure, while explicitly avoiding any commitment of Western ground troops, a deliberate echo of the lessons drawn from prolonged and costly ground occupations elsewhere in the region over the previous decade. For months, the war ground on in a kind of uneasy stalemate, rebel forces advancing and retreating across contested territory in the country's coastal cities, while NATO airstrikes gradually tilted the balance against the government Gaddafi had built, degrading his forces' ability to move heavy armor or coordinate large-scale offensives without exposing themselves to attack from the air. By August 2011, that balance had tipped decisively. Rebel forces pushed into Tripoli itself, and on August 23rd, they overran Bab al-Aziziyah, the fortified compound that had served as Gaddafi's seat of power and personal residence for decades, the same kind of symbolic heart of the regime that the Berka barracks had once represented on the night he seized power. With his capital lost, Gaddafi's government had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. Gaddafi himself did not surrender, and he did not flee the country. Instead, he retreated to the one place that had always represented the truest source of his identity and his power base, his hometown of Sirte, the coastal town near where he had been born, in a desert tent nearly 70 years earlier. His son Mutassim followed with a separate convoy of loyalists, and for the following 2 months, father and son, along with a shrinking circle of die-hard supporters, held out inside Sirte as National Transitional Council forces slowly encircled and closed in on the city. Accounts from those final weeks, drawn largely from members of Gaddafi's own inner circle who later spoke about the period, describe a man increasingly detached from the scale of what was happening around him, reportedly more consumed by complaints about the loss of electricity and running water in his besieged compound than by any coherent plan to reverse the collapse of his 42-year rule. Mansour Dao, the leader of Gaddafi's People's Guard, who remained with him through much of the siege, would later describe him as genuinely bewildered by the speed of events, still convinced that loyal tribes across the country would rise up to defend him once given the chance. A conviction that bore increasingly little resemblance to the military reality closing in around Sirte with each passing week. Advisors who urged him to flee the country entirely, to seek exile somewhere that might guarantee his safety. Several African nations, some reportedly still sympathetic given his years as chair of the African Union, were floated as possible destinations, found their pleas ignored. Whatever calculations were running through Gaddafi's mind in those final weeks, leaving Libya was apparently never seriously among them. On the morning of October 20th, 2011, as the last loyalist-held district of Sirte finally fell to advancing NTC forces, Gaddafi, his army chief Abu Bakr Yunis Jaber, his security chief Mansour Dao, and a substantial convoy of remaining loyalists attempted to break out of the city, reportedly hoping to reach open desert to the south, terrain Gaddafi had known intimately since childhood, and where he may have believed he still stood some chance of regrouping among sympathetic tribal networks. NATO surveillance aircraft, alerted by an intercepted satellite phone call, spotted the convoy moving at speed and struck it from the air. First a British reconnaissance aircraft locating the target, then a strike involving both an American drone and French fighter jets, destroying a significant portion of the vehicles attempting to escape and scattering the survivors on foot into the surrounding drainage culverts and scrubland outside the city. In the chaos following the airstrike, Gaddafi was located and captured alive by National Transitional Council fighters on the ground. He died a short time later, in the custody of the men who had captured him, under circumstances that remain deeply contested and were widely condemned by international human rights organizations as a serious violation of the legal protections owed even to a captured combatant. Rather than dwell on the disputed and disturbing details of those final minutes, what matters most for understanding the arc of this story is the outcome. 42 years of absolute personal rule over Libya ended, that morning, in the same region where it had begun. Gaddafi captured not far from the town where he had been born, and not far from the barracks in Benghazi where he had launched his revolution as a 27-year-old colonel. His body, along with that of his son Mutassim, who was killed separately by rebel fighters in Sirte that same day, was displayed publicly, reportedly in a commercial freezer in Misrata, where crowds of Libyans lined up for days to view the remains and confirm for themselves that the man who had ruled their entire lives was truly gone, before being buried on October 25th, 2011, at a secret location in the Libyan desert, the exact site never disclosed, in a final, almost symbolic irony, for a man who had spent his entire life invoking the desert as the truest source of his identity. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, called for an independent investigation into the circumstances of his death and demanded a proper autopsy. Libya's transitional authorities declined to conduct one, and no independent investigation was ever meaningfully completed, leaving the precise sequence of his final hour a matter of dispute that continues to surface periodically in later legal and journalistic inquiries. With Gaddafi's death, one of the longest personal reigns in modern African and Middle Eastern history came to an end. 42 years, almost exactly the span of a human generation, compressed into a single morning of gunfire on a desert road outside the town where it had all begun. Celebrations broke out across Libya, within hours of the news reaching Tripoli and Benghazi. crowds firing celebratory gunfire into the air, in scenes that would, within a remarkably short time, give way to a far more sober reckoning with exactly what kind of country would need to be built, in the absence of the only leader most Libyans alive at the time had ever known. It would be a mistake to close this story with Gaddafi's death, because the most difficult questions about his legacy were not resolved on that October morning in Sirte. If anything, they only became more urgent afterward, as the country he had ruled for 42 years struggled to answer a question his own system of committees and congresses had never actually needed to solve. What happens to a nation built entirely around the judgment of one man, once that man is gone? Consider the central paradox that runs through this entire story. The same man who built one of the most generous social welfare systems anywhere in Africa, free healthcare, free education through university, extensive public housing, social programs funded by oil wealth that in most other resource-rich nations simply vanished into the pockets of a ruling elite, was also a leader who tolerated no organized political opposition whatsoever, who imprisoned and executed dissidents, who funded political violence across multiple continents, and who was ultimately responsible, whether by direct order or institutional complicity, for one of the deadliest acts of terrorism in modern European history. By several development indices tracked through international organizations during his rule, Libya under Gaddafi achieved literacy rates, life expectancy figures, and per capita income levels that outpaced many of its regional neighbors, including some with considerably more benign international reputations, a genuine record of material improvement that Gaddafi's harshest critics rarely dispute, even as they catalogue, in the same breath, the systematic absence of any political freedom to accompany it. Gaddafi cannot be reduced to either half of that description without badly distorting the other, and any account of his life that leans too heavily on one side of the ledger while minimizing the other ends up telling a simpler, more comfortable story than the one that actually happened. Libya's fate after his death only sharpens the discomfort of that paradox. The optimistic assumption in 2011, shared by many of the Western governments that backed the NATO intervention, was that removing a 42-year dictatorship would clear the way for a more open, more accountable Libyan state. What actually followed was years of fragmentation, rival governments claiming legitimacy in different regions of the country, militia factions controlling territory the central state could not, a devastating slave trade that emerged in the security vacuum along migration routes through the country's south, and a level of chronic instability that for many ordinary Libyans made even the authoritarian order of the Gaddafi years look, in hindsight, like a stability they had not fully appreciated until it was gone. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the London-educated son once presented to Western audiences as a reformer, would himself later resurface as a presidential candidate in Libya's fractured post-war politics, a reminder that the family's shadow over the country's future did not end with his father's death in a drainage pipe outside Sirte. This is not an argument for tyranny. It is a sober reminder that toppling a dictator and building a functioning state are two entirely different achievements, and that the gap between them can cost a country far more, in lives and in years of lost stability, than the dictatorship itself ever did. There is also a broader pattern worth naming, one that Gaddafi's life illustrates perhaps more starkly than any other 20th century leader: the mad dog of the Middle East, once a target for assassination by the President of the United States, could, within less than 2 decades, become a man whose hand a British Prime Minister was proud to shake, chairing the African Union, addressing the United Nations, courted for his oil and his strategic cooperation. The relationship was never really about Gaddafi's character changing. It was about Western strategic interest recalculating, again and again, exactly how useful or dangerous his cooperation happened to be at any given moment. A calculation driven as much by oil contracts and counter-terrorism cooperation in the post-9/11 world as by any genuine reassessment of the nature of his rule at home, which remained, throughout every phase of his rehabilitation, exactly as centralized and exactly as intolerant of dissent as it had been during the years of his deepest isolation. That same recalculation, once the Arab Spring made him a liability rather than an asset, turned just as quickly in the other direction. And this time, there was no rehabilitation waiting on the other side, no negotiated settlement, no gradual thawing of relations after a period of punishment. Once the cost-benefit calculation shifted, it shifted completely and permanently. And finally, there is the fate of Gaddafi's own ideas. Unlike some of the other revolutionary figures whose lives resist neat conclusions, thinkers whose writings continued shaping political thought long after their deaths, Gaddafi's Green Book and his Third Universal Theory did not survive him in any meaningful intellectual sense. The Jamahiriya, the elaborate system of committees and congresses he insisted represented a purer form of popular democracy than anything the West had produced, evaporated almost the moment the man who built it was no longer alive to enforce it. Copies of the Green Book, once mandatory reading in Libyan schools and reproduced in murals across the country, were pulled from circulation and left to gather dust in the same libraries where students had once been required to recite its passages from memory. No successor state, in Libya or elsewhere, has ever attempted to govern according to its principles, and no serious school of political thought, outside Libya's own borders during Gaddafi's lifetime, ever treated the Third Universal Theory as anything more than the idiosyncratic invention of a single, singularly self-confident ruler. What remains of Gaddafi's legacy, then, is not a body of political philosophy still read and debated today, the way the writings of some of his contemporaries elsewhere in the anti-colonial world continue to be studied in universities decades after their authors died. It is instead a cautionary story about the seductive power of oil wealth to fund both genuine social progress and horrific violence simultaneously, sometimes from the very same treasury in the very same year, about how quickly international rehabilitation can be extended and withdrawn depending on strategic convenience rather than any fixed moral standard, and about how difficult it remains, even now, more than a decade after his death, to decide what to do with a man who cannot be filed neatly under either liberator or tyrant, because the honest answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that he was, at different moments, and sometimes simultaneously, both.